Right, next topic, and quite frankly, our last topic on the chapter for psychological disorders is personality disorders. Now, this set of disorders is a little bit different than what we talked about previously. Previously, we were talking about more acute disorders, disorders that can happen in episodes. You're not always experiencing them, whereas personality disorders are more chronic in nature. They are lifelong. They are a part of a person's personality, a part of their sort of the way, the manner that they interact with the world. And another difference, another sort of core difference that we see is the person who can be diagnosed with a personality disorder, they don't necessarily see a problem with their behavior, but perhaps other people around them may see a problem with their behavior. It might be that other people are, trying to get them diagnosed. That can happen with some of the previous disorders we've talked about too, but it can be especially true with personality disorders. So personality disorders are long-standing. They don't just go away. It's part of a person's life. Long-standing, rigid, very difficult to change. Behavior that we see is very difficult to change. Rigid, maladaptive, they cause problems for them or cause problems with people around them in social relationships and things like that. Maladaptive patterns of behavior that make it difficult for individuals to sustain healthy social relationships. All right, so with personality disorders, there are multiple disorders in this category. There are 10 currently recognized, listed in the DSM, personality disorders, and they're broken up into 3 clusters. We have cluster A, B, and C. For my students, when I test you on this, because everybody always wants to know what's going to be on the test, you will have some multiple choice questions where I might describe a disorder, describe some symptoms, and you either have to say what the disorder is, or you might have to say what cluster a disorder is in. So I do want you to know which disorders fit in which cluster. All right, so let's start with cluster A. Cluster A includes odd or eccentric behaviors. So what are we talking about? Odd and eccentric. We have 3 personality disorders. 3 personality disorders fit in cluster A. The first is paranoid personality disorder. Now, you might remember paranoia being something that you can see with schizophrenia. You can have things like delusions of persecution. And this, it's going to, some of the behavior may have some overlap with some of the things we talk about with schizophrenia, but not showing up in episodes, being more consistent and specifically focusing on paranoia in this case. And so this is extreme suspicion and distrust of others, everybody's against me sort of thinking, jealous and critical of others, and difficult to maintain relationships, because if a person is constantly mistrusting and jealous, it makes it difficult to connect with them. All right, so paranoid personality disorder. That's their long-term trend for interacting with the world. Now, we also have 2 disorders in this cluster that I sometimes feel like are unfortunately named because it sounds similar to one of the other disorders we've talked about, and so it means that people can get them confused. So we have the disorders schizoid personality disorder and schizotypal or schizotypal personality disorder. So people, they hear this, they think, oh, schizophrenia. No, not quite. All right, schizoid personality disorder. I don't like the word. It sounds like, students hear that, sometimes they giggle, unfortunately. It sounds almost like, it's almost like a made-up word if you're not familiar with the DSM. But that's what it's called. Some of these disorders in general, we feel like maybe they'd be better named with different labels. All right, so schizoid, their main feature is they're extreme loners. They don't want to interact with other people. They have no interest in relationships. They appear cold and unemotional. All right, so not typically what you think of when you think of schizophrenia, maybe more of the negative symptoms that you see with schizophrenia, but that one is labeled schizoid. Now, some people will hear this and they'll say, that sounds like some people with autism might act that way. Well, yes, just all of these have some kind of behavior that can overlap with other disorders. The key feature is this is their constant means of interacting with the world. Now, schizotypal personality disorder. Schizotypal, I've also heard it pronounced schizotypal. This has more of the behaviors that you might associate with symptoms of schizophrenia. You have peculiar and eccentric mannerisms and expression of personality, strange beliefs, and sometimes experiencing social anxiety. Relationships are difficult to maintain. That's a pretty constant symptom, and sometimes considered a mild form of schizophrenia. All right, so you can see how there'd be diagnostic issues trying to figure out, is this a personality disorder, or is this person, are they better diagnosed with schizophrenia? All right, so be familiar with those three. Those are your cluster A, odd and eccentric personality disorders. Now we've got cluster B, dramatic or impulsive behaviors. Cluster B, also, this one has four personality disorders go into cluster B. The first is antisocial personality disorder. Some people, they think of behavior that can be labeled as evidence of psychopathy, or someone being a psychopath or a sociopath. Those are some older terms applied to the behaviors that we see with antisocial personality disorder. So this is where you see chronic, criminal, and deviant behavior, accompanied by, and this is a key feature, a lack of conscience. So people with ASPD, they do not feel guilty about their misbehaviors, their crimes. They do something that hurts someone else, they're not going to feel bad about that. They'll be like, well, what's the big deal? You know, they are not going to exhibit guilt and empathy. Other people may engage in criminal behavior but feel bad about it, but they felt forced. This is someone who's like, well, I did that because I felt like it. Yeah, well, that hurt somebody. I don't care. All right. And this is observable by age 15. And you might have heard some misinformation about this one. Sometimes when I talk about this, people are like, I know this one. That is the serial killer disorder. No, that's not a good way to think about this, because while a lot of serial killers can be diagnosed with this disorder, a lot of people diagnosed with this disorder will never become serial killers. All right, you don't have to go to that extreme to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. All right, a person can lack that sense of consciousness. They can engage in criminal or manipulative or coercive behavior, but not necessarily go to the extreme of murder. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. Another disorder in cluster B starts with a B, and it's named, unfortunately, in many people's opinion, it's called borderline personality disorder. So a lot of people would say, okay, borderline between what and what? And it doesn't work that way. A lot of people say it would be better labeled as like emotional instability disorder or something similar to that, but that's the name. It's been used for a long time. All right, so borderline personality disorder is the style of interacting that involves dramatic and erratic emotions, feeling things deeply and not really knowing what to do with those intense feelings. Behaviors that often include self-harming behaviors, cutting behaviors are quite common, self-injurious behaviors are quite common with borderline personality disorder. They have an unstable self-image. They're not quite sure who they are, what they want, what they're even into. Sometimes they'll do the thing where they absorb the interests or the goals of people around them. They're like, well, they have an identity. I don't seem to have an identity. I'll absorb theirs, you know, sort of behavior. And they have unstable mood. They have mood swings or intense mood experiences. And their relationships can be kind of shaky and unsteady. One thing about depiction of borderline personality disorder, or the way people talk about it, in my own personal experiences, when I learned about this in undergraduate and graduate educational experiences, I found that my professors often focused on how annoying it was to work with these individuals. But now, you know, living life, getting older, I've known people with this disorder, and when you look at it from their perspective, you know, it's insensitive to think of it that way. Very often, they're just trying to figure out how to function. They're like, I wish I knew how to be more predictable, be more stable. And one TV show, the TV show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend with Rachel Bloom. And her character was Rebecca Bunch. The main character was named Rebecca Bunch, and she was eventually diagnosed with borderline personality disorder in that show. And one thing I really liked about that show was that since it was from her perspective, it wasn't a haha, let's laugh at this person sort of thing. Also, I have seen movies where they had a character who exhibited signs and symptoms of borderline personality disorder, and it was played as if this is the scary character. Like, you got to watch out for that person. They're scary. You don't know what they're going to do. Very insensitive portrayals of this disorder. Now, the textbook that we use for my class, it goes into some more detail about borderline personality disorder, partially because it's quite a prevalent personality disorder. And it talks about the three I's in borderline personality disorder, which includes instability in relationships, identity disturbance, and then impulsive behaviors. Doing things without acting, like they might spend a lot of money without thinking. They might sign up for something without thinking ahead. Just general impulsive, unpredictable behavior sometimes. All right, so be familiar with those three I's for borderline personality disorder. Now, another cluster B disorder is histrionic personality disorder. That word histrionic, a lot of people may not be familiar with that word, but that kind of means over dramatic. Don't be histrionic. You're telling somebody not to be over dramatic. So this is a person who is excessively dramatic and emotional. They can be manipulative, and they are very focused on being the center of attention at all times, and they have an excessive display of emotions. They don't hold anything back. They show their emotions. They tend to be emotionally shallow, according to the description in the book, and thrive on the approval and praise of others. So the sort of thing you might see with histrionic behavior, histrionic symptoms, like they might always dress in an extreme manner to be the center of attention, like always dressing fancy, always dressing in bright colors, always trying to dominate conversation and speaking in a manner, like everybody needs to listen to me. And even some people in the performing arts can show some of the signs, not necessarily that they have histrionic personality disorder, but they can show some of these behaviors. All right, now we also have one more cluster B disorder, and that is narcissistic personality disorder. Many people have heard of narcissism or the word narcissistic. So this includes an inflated sense of self-worth. That person thinks they are special, they are unique in some way, and they feel like they are particularly important. And they have a need for deep admiration from others. If they get any kind of indication that other people don't think that they're amazing, that other people do not worship them, they will get upset. That's like a threat to their self-image. Like, people need to worship me. That's the sort of thing you see with narcissistic personality disorder. They will appear conceited and preoccupied with fantasies of their own success. If they're talking about something, they like to talk about how amazing they are. If people are not talking about how great they are, they will get bored and want to leave or change the subject. That's the sort of thing that you might see. And then and I know personally on social media, there's all sorts of stuff out there of people talking about how to deal with like a narcissistic parent, a narcissistic boss, narcissistic people in the workplace. Generally, they're not necessarily talking about somebody with the full-blown disorder, just someone exhibiting these characteristics. But somebody with narcissistic personality disorder, that's like their defining core features, is they are defined and driven by their narcissism. Right now, we've got another cluster. We've got cluster C. Cluster C has a lot of behavior that is similar to what we talked about with anxiety disorders. And so that includes your anxious or fearful behaviors. So first we have avoidant personality disorder, which looks a lot like social anxiety disorder. That's kind of a criticism, like, hey, these things look very similar. And so they have social anxiety, feelings of inadequacy, and they want social interaction, but their shyness, their avoidance gets in the way, prevents them from having that. They have intense fear of rejection. It makes it difficult to maintain relationships. Sounds a lot like social anxiety disorder. But if someone is diagnosed with avoidant personality disorder. That's the sort of consistent, chronic, rigid behavior that we see. Now, we also have dependent personality disorder in cluster C. This involves clinginess or dependent behaviors, difficult making decisions, often seeking reassurance from others, like, am I doing okay? Am I doing okay? I need help with this. And even if you tell them how to do something, they come back like, oh, can you tell me again? Those are the sort of things you might see with these disorders. And they have a difficult time with separation. Like, you leave them for a day, they might be texting you constantly, like, where are you now? Trying to make sure that you're okay, you're still there, you're coming back. Now, we also have another disorder, our final personality disorder, and our final personality disorder in cluster C is also named in a way that it can be easily confused with another disorder, and it is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. It can be diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder just because of the way that it is named, and this is someone who is obsessed, concerned with orderliness, perfection, everything being just right. They like rules, schedules, and order. Everything's got to have a system. They may have difficulty maintaining relationships because they've got so many rules. It's hard to meet all of their expectations. All right, so notice, unlike obsessive compulsive disorder, this one did not mention obsessions and compulsions. It's just sort of what Freud might call being anal retentive, just that intense need for order. All right. Okay, so my students, be familiar with all 10 personality disorders. Definitely with borderline personality disorder, focus on those 3 I's. Be familiar with which one goes in which cluster. Be prepared for a test question where I describe some symptoms or some behavior, and you can say which personality disorder that it's most consistent with. All right, that is the end of the chapter, the end of what I'm covering for the chapter on psychological disorders. I always like to end with one very important message about this chapter. Any one of us could experience these disorders or their symptoms at any time in our lives. So we always have to remember when we're learning about these disorders, all right, we should be sensitive and non-judgmental. And just remember that we don't learn about these we don't want this to be a freak show or an episode of Maury. Do we remember Maury? I remember for a while Maury was a very popular talk show where sometimes they'd have people come out and talk about their rare, unusual disorders, and it was done in sort of a freak show manner. All right? This is not the purpose of a psychology class. This is to learn about these disorders and to remember to be sensitive because people you know may have these disorders. You may experience these disorders in your future, and you're going to want empathy. You're going to want empathy, understanding, and hopefully lack of judgment. All right, so I always like to end on that note.